History didn't change by war, it changed by money. We're taught history changes when armies win, but the real turning points happen when economic power shifts. And once money moves, the world follows. Because military victories can shock the world for a moment, but economic power decides who controls the future, who builds the strongest systems, who funds the next war, who controls trade, and who shapes everyday life for millions of people. And the truth is, the biggest world-changing moments in history often didn't start with a battlefield. They started with a shift in wealth, a shift in trade routes, a shift in production, or a shift in the way money worked. Welcome to FrameHistoro, where we break down history through systems, incentives, and real power, not just kings and battles. And today, we're going to follow the money, how economic power moved from one civilization to another, and how each shift rewrote world history. Because once you understand how money moves, you start seeing history like a chain of handoffs. One civilization rises, not only because it is brave, but because it becomes the new center of trade, finance, or production, and the civilization that loses that position starts falling, even if it still has an army. Now, it starts at the beginning, because the first major economic power centers were built around one simple thing: control of food and water. Early civilizations didn't become wealthy because they had banks. They became wealthy because they could reliably feed large populations. Mesopotamia grew because irrigation turned rivers into farms. Egypt grew because the Nile created predictable harvests. And once a society could grow a surplus, it could support cities, governments, and specialists, builders, soldiers, priests, and merchants. Surplus created complexity, and complexity created power. And here's the key point. The first economic power shift in history wasn't about conquest. It was about organization. The civilizations that managed water, storage, and agriculture better became the first economic giants. But over time, something else began creating wealth even faster than farming: trade. Because trade allowed civilizations to grow rich without producing everything themselves. It connected different regions, different resources, and different skills. And soon, the biggest economic centers weren't only farms. They were crossroads, places where goods had to pass, where merchants had to stop, and where taxes could be collected. This is where cities became engines of wealth, not just communities. And it's one reason why the ancient Mediterranean became such a powerful economic zone. Sea travel was faster and cheaper than land travel, and once civilizations learned to dominate the sea, economic power shifted toward those who controlled ports and shipping. This is where the Phoenicians became a quiet economic force. They didn't build a huge land empire like Rome, but they built a network of trade cities and ports across the Mediterranean. They moved goods, built ships, and connected markets. And the power they gained wasn't about occupying land. It was about controlling access. And here is the first major lesson. Economic power goes to whoever controls movement, not just whoever controls territory. But trade didn't only move goods, it moved influence. And soon, the world saw larger economic systems form. And one of the biggest was the Silk Road network. Not a single road, but many connected routes linking China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Europe. And in this system, the strongest players weren't always the far ends. They were often the middle powers, the ones who controlled the checkpoints, the safe passages, and the trade hubs. Because controlling the connection makes you wealthy, even if you don't create the product. It's like running the bridge everyone has to cross. You don't need to own the towns. You just profit from the flow. And this is where economic power began shifting again and again to whoever could protect the trade routes, tax them, and keep them stable. Now, let's talk about one of the biggest economic shifts in human history: the rise of Rome. Rome didn't just win battles. Rome built systems, roads, laws, and stable trade networks across the Mediterranean. And stability is money, because merchants invest where they feel safe. Businesses grow where rules are predictable, and cities expand when supply lines are reliable. So Rome became not only a military empire, but an economic powerhouse. because it created a large stable market under one rule system. And that made trade easier, cheaper, and more profitable. But here's the part most people miss. Rome didn't fall just because of invasions. Rome weakened because economic power began shifting away from the center. Trade became less secure, taxes became heavier, money lost value, and local regions started becoming more independent. And once the economic system broke, Rome's military strength couldn't fix it, because armies can't create trade by force. They can only protect it. If the system underneath is broken, soldiers can't hold the world together forever. And that brings us to another major economic shift: the rise of the Islamic Golden Age. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, economic and intellectual centers shifted. Cities in the Islamic world became major hubs of trade, science, and finance. Places like Baghdad became connected nodes between East and West. And the Islamic world benefited from position, trade networks, and innovation. And this is a major pattern. Economic power often shifts toward the civilization that sits at the best crossroads, the one that becomes the main connector of goods, knowledge, and money. And when economic power shifts, culture often shifts too, because wealth funds learning, architecture, scholarship, and influence. Money doesn't just buy armies, it buys ideas. Now move forward again, because another huge economic power shift arrived with the Indian Ocean Trade Network. This was one of the richest trade systems in the world, connecting East Africa, the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, and China. And cities that controlled ports became incredibly wealthy, because sea trade moved huge amounts of goods, and it moved them faster than land routes. And this is where trade empires like Srivijaya became powerful, not by conquering everything, but by controlling choke points like the Strait of Malacca. And this teaches a key truth: economic power doesn't always sit in the biggest empire. It often sits in the best position, the best location for controlling flow. And now, we reach one of the biggest shifts that changed world history forever: Europe's rise through ocean routes. For a long time, Europe wasn't the richest part of the world. The wealth was centered in Asia and the Middle East. But Europe began pushing into the oceans, trying to reach Asian markets directly. And once Portugal, Spain, and later the Dutch and British created global sea routes, the center of economic power began shifting west. Because sea routes allowed Europe to bypass old land networks, build overseas trade empires, and pull wealth into Atlantic economies. And this wasn't just about ships. It was also about finance, because global trade is expensive. You need capital, insurance, credit, and large investment. And this is where economic power shifted again, toward civilizations that built strong financial systems. The Dutch are a perfect example. They were not the biggest country, but they built advanced banking, global trade networks, and strong markets. And they proved something modern people understand very well: a strong financial system can make a small nation act like a giant. And then Britain took that model and scaled it. Britain didn't just build an empire with war, it built it with economic structure, a navy to protect trade, an industrial base to produce goods, and financial credibility to borrow money and fund growth. Britain became powerful because it controlled both the flow of trade and the flow of finance. And once again, we see the main rule: economic power moves to the civilization that controls the system everyone depends on. But then came the Industrial Revolution, and this created one of the biggest economic shifts in history, because economic power stopped being mostly about trade position and became about production capacity. Factories, machines, railroads, and mass manufacturing. Industrial power meant you could produce faster, cheaper, and at larger scale than anyone else. And that meant you could outcompete rivals, supply your military, and flood global markets with your goods. And industrial strength turned into global leverage. And this shift helped move power toward nations that industrialized early and deeply. And then, in the 20th century, economic power shifted again, toward the United States. After major global wars, Europe was damaged, and the US had huge industrial capacity, stable institutions, and growing influence. America didn't just become powerful because of military strength. It became powerful because of economic scale, production, innovation, and global trade leadership. And the US dollar became a major part of global economic life. And this is another important point. Currency itself can be power. Because when the world trusts your money, it trusts your stability, and that trust creates influence. And here's the deeper lesson behind all of these shifts. History changes when money changes hands, not always through violence, but through the movement of trade routes, the movement of production, the movement of innovation, and the movement of trust. And when economic power shifts, everything else shifts with it. Politics, culture, alliances, and even the rules of daily life. That's why the real turning points often happen quietly. A new shipping lane opens, a new technology spreads, a new financial system wins trust, a new industrial base grows, and over time, the world rearranges itself around the new center of wealth. And this is why wars often follow economic shifts, not the other way around. Because once one civilization becomes richer, it can afford stronger protection, stronger systems, and stronger influence, and others either adapt, compete, or fall behind. So here's the simplest way to say it. Armies can take land, but money decides who can keep it, and money decides who can build the future. Now, let's bring this to a simple modern question. If history changes when economic power shifts, what causes economic power to shift today? Is it technology, energy, global supply chains, trade partnerships, currency trust, or innovation? Because, in the modern world, economic power still moves, just faster and quieter, and sometimes people don't notice until the shift is already deep. And that is why understanding history matters. Not to panic, not to exaggerate, but to see patterns clearly. The biggest forces shaping the world are often not loud. They are structural, and once money moves, the world follows. So here's a final reflective question to leave you with. If economic power decides the direction of history, what systems should a civilization protect the most? Armies, or the foundations that make armies possible? Trade, production, trust, and stability. Because history keeps giving the same answer, the real turning points happen when economic power shifts. And once money moves, the world follows. If you enjoyed this documentary breakdown, subscribe and explore more videos on FrameHistoro. Because the more you understand how money shaped history, the more clearly you understand the world today. Thanks for watching.